All right, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and take a look at these practice problems. Just like when we were talking, or we were going through those example problems at the beginning of this lesson, there's going to be, I think, 3 or 4 of these problems we're going to skip. So we're going to skip number 17, number 18, number 21, number 31, and that should be it. So we'll do all the other ones. So let's take a look at number 16. Just a quick reminder in case you didn't write it down or you need to write that down. There's the quadratic formula. A couple of the main things we talked about is this idea of the quadratic formula in part 1. This quadratic formula, when you plug in A, B, and C, you plug in all that information, you're basically going to be able to calculate without having to factor the x-intercepts, the zeros, the roots, whatever you want to call them. So really helpful, it's kind of a brainless way of having to do this. Another thing we talked about is what they call the discriminant. So the discriminant is that piece that's underneath the radical sign. So b squared minus 4ac, that's the discriminant. And that tells you how many roots you have, how many zeros, how many x-intercepts you have. So if you remember, I think, let me go and look back on page 112. You can flip back and look at that. On page 112, it tells you if you calculate the discriminant and that number is greater than 0, you're going to have 2 x-intercepts. If you calculate the discriminant and that number is 0, it's equal to 0, it is 0, you're going to have 1 x-intercept. And if you calculate the discriminant and that number is less than 0, you will have no x-intercepts. It will not touch your x-axis. All right. So let's go ahead and start going through here. Number 16. X squared minus 10x plus 25. So we'll use the quadratic formula. X equals, remember, I always said with this formula, it's pretty straightforward, but except for this part right here, don't think that that first term is always going to be a negative value of b. Think about that as the opposite of b. So in this case, it looks like a is 1, b is negative 10, c is 25. I'll go ahead and write that. A is 1, b is negative 10, c is 25. So that first number is going to be the opposite of b, so that's positive 10, plus or minus the square root of b squared. I'm going to go ahead and write this out with this first example, but I'll kind of simplify that as we go through here. So b squared, negative 10 squared, minus 4 times a times c, and that entire right side of the equation is divided by 2 times a. So how I would do this is I would not recommend just typing this from left to right into a calculator. It can be really easy to mess that up. So what I would do is step 1, plug in A, B, and C everywhere you see it. Step 2, calculate the discriminant. Calculate that part that's underneath the radical. Negative 10 squared is 100. Negative 4 times 1 times 25, that's negative 100. And 2 times 1 is 2. So that would be my second step. Just calculate the discriminant. Go ahead and simplify that denominator. That's pretty easy too, but don't try to do too many steps at once. Now I would go ahead and kind of simplify, or I would totally, reduce that discriminant down. 100 minus 100 is 0. Now, after my second step of calculating, actually after my second step of, plugging everything in and then calculating the discriminant, I would go ahead and just take the square root of that number. In this case, you take a calculator, you type in the square root of 0, it gives you 0. So it's 10 plus or minus 0 divided by 2. So this is giving you 2 separate x-intercepts. Notice the direction. One of them is going to be 10 plus 0 divided by 2. The other direction is going to be 10 minus 0 divided by 2. I know you're adding and subtracting zeros, so it doesn't change, but imagine that that was 10 plus or minus 7. right? This is the process you're doing. You're adding 0 to 1, and then you're subtracting 0 from the other. 10 plus 0 is 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So there's one of my x-intercepts. 10 minus 0 is 10. 10 divided by 2 is also 5. So in this case, this is the part where this quadratic here, if you went to graph it, would have an x-intercept at 5. It's a positive parabola, so just that vertex would be at x equals 5. So it would look something like that if you went to graph it. Only one x-intercept, right? We did two different calculations, but both those calculations end up being the same. They're both positive 5, so that x-intercept is at positive 5, and there's only one x-intercept. Let's make sure we did what we wanted. Okay, yep, solve the equation. Perfect. 17. X squared. Actually, we're skipping 17, right? Yeah, I got to follow my notes. We're skipping 18, so we are doing 19. 19 is the next one we're going to see. X squared plus 9x minus 1 equals 3x minus 10. So number 19, we're skipping 17 and 18 because those have imaginary numbers and we're not going down that route. So for number 19, you can't factor a quadratic. You can't use the quadratic formula unless this thing is equal to 0. So I'm going to go ahead and make this equal to 0. So I'll subtract 3x. I'll add 10. I'll have x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 0. Do the quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared, minus 4 times a times c, and that's all divided by 2 times a. So there's things that you'll do to kind of simplify this process. Notice that I just wrote 36 instead of 6 squared. Another thing I could have done is just done 2 times 1 and just written 2 at the very bottom here, right? There's a couple little tiny baby steps you can do as you're filling this out, but don't try to do too much work into one step, right? Don't try to do too much stuff in your head. I think that's pretty straightforward. That radicand, right? What's underneath the radical sign? The discriminant. Negative 4 times 1 times 9, that's negative 36. 36 minus 36 is 0. So it's going to be very similar to the last one we did. So the square root of 0 is 0. So one direction is going to be negative 6 plus 0 divided by 2. The other one will be negative 6 minus 0 divided by 2. Negative 6 plus 0 is negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. Same thing with the other side. So this is very similar to number 16. At negative 3, this parabola is going to look something like that. It'll have one single x-intercept. Number 20, 3x squared minus 20x minus 7. All right, so we'll plug it into the formula. X equals opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. And that whole thing is divided by 2 times a, right? So you see I kind of skipped a couple things. I did b squared instead of writing negative 20 squared. I just put 400. I still kept negative 4 times a times c, but then in the denominator, I just did 2 times a. 2 times 3 is 6. So there's little baby steps you can do to kind of clean it up as you go along. Negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Negative 12 times negative 7, that's positive 84. So we've got 20 plus or minus the square root of 400 plus 84 divided by 6. I'm going to use my calculator to see if 400 plus 84, that's 484. I'm going to see if the square root of 484 is a nice number. Let me check. Perfect. It's 22. So 400 plus 84 is 484. The square root of 484 is 22. All right, so 400 plus 84, I'm gonna go ahead and write this out just to make sure everybody's on the same page as me. 484 divided by 6. The square root of 484 is 22. So notice that one direction is gonna be 20 plus 22 over 6. The other direction is gonna be 20 minus 22 over 6. So this is 44 over 6, 22 over 3. That's negative 2/6, so negative 1/3. So there are my x-intercepts. Negative 1/3, 22 thirds. This is a positive parabola, so it would look something like that. Super rough sketch, but just kind of to get the point across. All right. We're skipping 21, because again, that is an imaginary numbers problem. So we'll go on to number 22. 22 looks like it jumps us down to the next section. So if in this practice section, if you don't feel like you did enough of those types of problems, you can always come over to this understand section and kind of look through there, see if you can do any of those. What I would recommend if you need some more problems to practice on using the quadratic formula is going to Envision and accessing those extra assignments that I loaded against you, because there'll be a ton more problems that you can practice that skill on. So 22 is our next problem. Use the discriminant. So remember, the discriminant is x equals opposite b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2.